The hot Arizona sun beat down on the rock as he relaxed by his sparkling pool in his expansive backyard. He had worked tirelessly to afford this property, complete with a large pool and lush green landscaping. It was his personal sanctuary, a place of tranquility where he could escape the stress of the world. Lately, however, that peace had been shattered. Small things started happening: pool chairs displaced, towels gone missing, and wet footprints leading toward the gate. At first, the Rock shrugged it off. Maybe he had forgotten to move things around, but as days passed, the evidence grew undeniable. Someone had been using his pool without permission. He pulled out his phone and reviewed the security footage. His next-door neighbor, Monica, appeared on the screen, sneaking into his yard for an unauthorized swim. She looked like she thought the whole neighborhood was her property. It wasn't an accident or a mistake. It was entitlement. Monica lived a few doors down in a shabby house that contrasted with the Rock's well-maintained estate. She had a reputation for meddling in other people's business, gossiping, and always acting like she knew everything about everyone. If there was a conflict, she made sure everyone knew about it, especially if she could turn it into something that would make her seem like the victim. What made the Rock angriest, though, wasn't just the fact that Monica had been trespassing on his property. It was the audacity she had, glaring at him whenever she crossed paths with him, as if he were the intruder. Enough was enough. One afternoon, the Rock decided he would confront Monica once and for all. He left the gate unlocked, knowing that it was just a matter of time before she would try to sneak in again. He sat back in his lounge chair, waiting. Sure enough, Monica appeared wearing a poorly fitting bathing suit. She slipped into his pool as though she owned the place. The Rock stood up from his chair and crossed his arms, enjoying the irony of the moment. "Enjoying yourself, Monica?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with challenge. Monica shrieked in surprise, slipping in the water as she scrambled to get out. "What the hell are you doing here?" she snapped, furious, as though he were the one in the wrong. The Rock raised an eyebrow, keeping his cool. "I'm in my pool, on my property," he said, his voice firm. Monica snatched a towel, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "You don't even use it that much," she muttered, trying to avoid his gaze as she stormed out of the water. The Rock clenched his jaw, holding back the urge to escalate things. "This isn't a public pool, Monica. If I catch you here again, I'll call the police." Monica's face twisted with rage. "Oh, so now you're threatening me," she hissed, but she was already stomping away, clearly done with the confrontation. The Rock could see it in her eyes. Monica slammed the door behind her as she paced her living room, fuming. How dare the Rock talk to her like that? She had lived in the neighborhood long before he moved in. Who did he think he was, just because? He had money now. She wasn't going to let this slide. She snatched her phone from the counter and dialed 911, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. "Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious man in my neighborhood," she said, her voice filled with fake distress. "He's in a backyard where he shouldn't be. I think he might be trying to break in." The dispatcher asked for more details, and Monica fed them a fabricated story, describing the Rock as a dangerous intruder, emphasizing his size and the aggression in his voice. It was all a lie, but she knew the system would take her side. Once the call was made, Monica dialed another number. "Chad, you need to come down here now," she hissed into the phone. Chad, her brother, was a police officer. He had always protected her growing up, and now, with his badge, he had even more power to make sure her manipulations worked. "There's a man in the backyard next door," Monica continued, playing up her fake distress. "He threatened me." "Chad?" "He said if I called the cops, She sniffled for effect. "I don't feel safe." Chad's response was swift. "I'll handle it," he said, and hung up. Minutes later, Chad arrived at the neighborhood, his police car screeching, to a halt in front of the Rock's house. His partner, Officer Daniels, sat beside him, looking uneasy. "You sure this is a priority?" Daniels asked, glancing at Chad. Chad's jaw tightened. "I know my sister. If she says she's in danger, she means it." Daniels didn't question him further, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As they walked toward the Rock's backyard, Chad already had his hand on his holster. He was determined to teach this guy a lesson. As they approached, Monica stood by the fence, a smug grin on her face, her arms crossed. Chad pointed at the Rock, who was still drying off. "Sir, I need you to step off the property immediately." The Rock raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me," Chad snapped. "We got a call about a trespasser. You match the description." The Rock let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Yeah, I bet." "I do." He folded his arms, standing as Officer Daniels hesitated. The Rock's calm and collected demeanor didn't match the description Monica had given them. Something wasn't adding up, but Chad wasn't interested in asking questions. "Listen," Chad barked, "you need to leave before this gets worse for you." Monica chuckled from behind them, her tone dripping with fake concern. "Yeah. I told you he was trouble." The Rock didn't even glance at her, his focus still on Chad. "I'd love to hear exactly what crime I've committed," he said coolly. Chad's patience snapped. "You're trespassing on private property." The Rock tilted his head. "Whose property?" Chad faltered for just a second, then quickly recovered. "Monica's called it in. She wouldn't lie." The Rock turned slowly toward Monica, his expression unreadable. "You sure about that?" he asked, his voice steady. Officer Daniels was becoming more suspicious. The Rock's unshaken demeanor didn't match a man trying to cover something up. "Maybe we should—" Chad cut him off. "No, we don't need to do anything. This guy is wasting our time." Chad turned back to the Rock, his voice turning sharp. "I'm not asking again. Leave now, or I'll make you." The Rock exhaled slowly, then walked over to a small table near the patio. "All right," he said. "You want proof? I'll give you proof." Chad scoffed. "Oh, this should be good." Monica smirked, anticipating the humiliation the Rock was about to face, but neither of them had any idea what was coming next. The Rock moved deliberately, unfazed by the mounting tension in the air. He took his time unlocking his phone, his movements, slow and measured, as though he were on his own turf, because in reality he was. He wasn't in a hurry to prove anything to anyone, and the calmness with which he moved made Chad fidget uncomfortably, as if something didn't sit right with him. The Rock slid his finger across the screen and pulled up an email. He turned, his phone toward the officers. "Here's my deed," he said nonchalantly, watching their reactions, "in case you need proof that this is my property." Officer Daniels leaned in, taking a closer look at the document. His brow furrowed as he read, the legal text confirming what the Rock had been saying all along. Then, without missing a beat, the Rock swiped to another file. "And here's my mortgage agreement," he continued, swiping again to reveal the official document. "I can also show you my utility bills, my ID or the security company I hired, to monitor my property, whatever you need." Daniels looked at the documents, his stomach twisting. The Rock was telling the truth. Everything was in order, but Chad wasn't buying it. His eyes narrowed suspiciously, his arms crossed over his chest. "How do I know this isn't fake?" Chad asked, his voice laced with skepticism. The Rock chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't," he said, as though the whole situation were absurd. "But I'm happy to wait while you verify it with dispatch." Officer Daniels opened his mouth to speak, but the Rock wasn't done yet. "Oh, and while we're on the topic of crimes happening on this property," he said, tapping his phone screen again, "maybe you should take a look at what my security cameras captured." Both officers looked at him, and Daniels, now intrigued, leaned in closer. The Rock pressed play. The first video that appeared was of Monica, sneaking into his backyard, stripping down to her swimsuit, and slipping into his pool like it was no big deal. She appeared to have no shame, no second thought about violating his space. The second video was even more telling. Monica could be seen hastily yanking envelopes from the Rock's mailbox, stuffing them into her purse, and walking away as though nothing were amiss. The sound of her footsteps and the soft rustling of paper could be heard on the video. But it was the third video that made Daniel's blood run cold. The camera had captured Monica standing on the Rock's porch, kicking over a small crate. A terrified yelp followed as the crate tipped over, revealing a small dog inside. Monica sneered, muttering something inaudible under her breath before turning and walking away, as if she had just kicked over a pile of trash. Daniels took an instinctive step back, his face twisted in horror. "Jesus Christ," he muttered under his breath, his voice strained with disbelief. The Rock slowly turned his phone back toward himself, locking eyes with Monica. "Now remind." "Me again," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Who's the criminal here?" Monica's face twisted with panic. Her carefully crafted facade began to crack. That's taken out of context," she blurted, her voice rising in panic. Rock raised an eyebrow. "Oh, really? Want to go ahead and check the timestamps?" he asked coolly. "I can assure you the footage hasn't been edited." Daniel's jaw clenched as he processed everything in front of him. The evidence was undeniable. Monica's smug expression, which had been so present moments before, was replaced by sheer panic. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She had no words to explain away her actions. Chad, on the other hand, was visibly losing control. His face had turned a deep shade of red, and his hands were balled into fists at his sides. "This is bullshit," he snarled, his voice trembling with rage. "You're lying." Daniels took a deep breath, his hand still holding Marcus's phone. "We can't ignore this," he said firmly, his voice now cold and professional. "Stealing someone's mail is a federal offense, and that dog, well, that's animal cruelty." Monica whipped around to face her brother, panic clearly written on her face. "Chad, do something!" she screamed, her voice high-pitched with desperation. Chad's nostrils flared. His hand hovered over his holster, his breath coming out in ragged gasps. "No one's arresting my sister," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. Daniels didn't flinch. "I'm arresting her for what she's done," he said, his tone unwavering. "This isn't personal, Chad, it's the law." But Chad was beyond reasoning now. His vision was clouded by fury, his loyalty to his sister blinding him to the truth. Without warning, he lunged at Daniels, fist swinging, attempting to push him away. Daniels barely had time to react before they collided. The two men struggled, limbs tangled in a flurry of motion. Chad was strong, his fists hammering down on Daniels as his voice shouted over the chaos. "You don't know what you're doing! She's my sister!" Daniels fought back with precision, each movement calculated. He'd been in dangerous situations before and knew how to defend himself. His uniform strained under the force of Chad's blows, but he didn't let up. The Rock, who had been silently watching the confrontation, realized the situation was escalating. He couldn't stand by any longer. In one swift motion, he rushed forward and grabbed Chad from behind, locking his arms around Chad's torso, pulling him off of Officer Daniels. "Let go of him," the Rock shouted, pulling with all his might. Chad bucked and twisted, but the Rock held firm, his strength overwhelming Chad's fury. With Daniels' help, they managed to restrain Chad. The officers worked together, forcing him to the ground. Chad, despite his strength, was no match for them. The Rock stood over him, breathing heavily from the exertion, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. Daniels secured Chad's hands with cuffs, his own body shaking from the adrenaline rush. "You're under arrest for assaulting an officer and abuse of power," he declared, his voice steady but tinged with disgust. Chad said nothing, his eyes burning with rage. He was dragged to his feet and led to the patrol car, his face red with humiliation. Monica, meanwhile, stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock. Her smug expression had completely disappeared. The situation had spiraled out of her control and now she was about to face the consequences of her actions. The Rock watched as Chad was led to the patrol car, his face twisted in anger and defeat. Monica, standing nearby, looked like a deer caught in headlights. She had always been the queen of her small world, able to manipulate and control everyone around her. But now, her world was crumbling, and there was no way to spin this. As Daniels turned toward her, his voice firm and unwavering, the air around them seemed to crackle with tension. "Monica Montgomery, you're under arrest for trespassing, theft, and animal cruelty," Daniels said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Monica's face drained of color. The words felt like a slap across the face. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat. She had no defense, no excuses left. The evidence was undeniable, the videos exposing everything she had done. The carefully constructed persona of the innocent neighbor, the sweet woman who always had a kind word to say, had shattered. It was as if the ground had been ripped from beneath her feet. No, this can't be happening," she muttered, almost to herself, her voice a mix of disbelief and panic. She looked from Chad to Daniels, desperation in her eyes. "You can't do this to me," she whimpered, her voice growing more frantic. "I didn't do anything wrong. He's lying. He's making all of this up." But even as she spoke, she knew deep down that her words didn't carry any weight anymore. There was no escaping the reality of the situation. Daniels moved toward her, reaching for his handcuffs, his eyes fixed on her, unmoved by her pleas. "You're under arrest, Monica. It's over." Monica's body trembled as she took a step back, but her retreat was cut short when Daniels closed the gap. With a swift motion, he placed her hands behind her back, securing the cuffs around her wrists. She gasped, her breath coming in short bursts, unable to believe what was happening. It was all happening too fast, and she was powerless to stop it. Chad, still seething with rage, shouted from where he was being held, his voice filled with fury. "This isn't over, Monica," he called out, his words laced with a venomous promise. "I'll fix this. You won't go down like this. I won't let them do this to you." Monica's eyes flickered briefly toward her brother, a flicker of hope sparking in her chest. But it was quickly replaced by the crushing reality of her situation. Chad wasn't going to get her out of this. She had made too many mistakes, crossed too many lines, and now there was no one left to shield her from the consequences. Officer Daniels didn't waste another moment. He motioned for Monica to walk toward the patrol car. She stumbled forward, her face pale, her eyes filled with fear and regret. Every step felt like a mile, each one bringing her closer to the truth she had spent so long avoiding. As they walked past the rock, Monica's gaze briefly met his. He didn't speak, but the coldness in his eyes was enough to send a chill down her spine. She knew that he had seen everything, the trespassing, the theft, the cruelty, and now he had all the power. The rock stood there, still, his posture straight, a mixture of calm satisfaction and quiet resolve. He had been patient through all of this, but now, seeing Monica in cuffs, he couldn't help but feel a sense of justice. He had fought for his rights, but he had also exposed the darkness that had been festering in his own neighborhood. He had faced the storm, and now he was standing on the other side of it. But even as he watched the officers escort Monica to the car, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Not for him, not for the neighborhood, and not for the twisted game Monica had been playing for so long. The neighborhood, once filled with whispers and fears, was about to change. Word of Monica's arrest would spread like wildfire, and people who had once turned a blind eye to her actions would now have no choice but to confront the truth. The mask had fallen, and her facade of innocence was no more. And as the patrol cars pulled away, the rock stood in his yard, feeling the weight of the situation settle around him. His peaceful retreat, the sanctuary he had built, had been disrupted. But now there was a sense of finality. He had stood his ground. He had protected his home. But more than that, he had brought light to the darkness that had been allowed to linger in the shadows for far too long. As the backup officers continued to manage the scene, Monica and Chad's world continued to unravel. They were no longer the untouchable figures they once believed themselves to be. Now they were just two criminals facing the consequences of their actions. The Rock's victory was bittersweet, however. He had stood up for himself, but it wasn't just about the pool or the trespassing anymore. It was about exposing the people who used their positions to manipulate and control. The streets were filled with murmurs of disbelief. Neighbors who had once silently supported Monica, afraid of confronting her, began to question the image they had built around her. The truth had surfaced, and it was impossible to ignore. People who had once looked away now saw the full scope of the situation, the manipulation, the lies, and the cruelty. As Monica and Chad sat in separate police cars, their future uncertain, the Rock could finally breathe a little easier. But even in the quiet of his backyard, he knew the aftermath of this incident would linger. This wasn't just a battle for his property, it was a battle for respect, for justice, and for peace in a neighborhood that had long been ruled by fear as he. The last of the police vehicles disappeared down the street. The Rock looked around his property, his sanctuary once again. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the yard, and for the first time in weeks, he could feel the weight lifting from his shoulders. Justice had been served, not just for him, but for the entire community. The quiet that descended upon the neighborhood after the arrests was deafening. Monica and Chad, once the untouchable figures of the area, had been unmasked. The streets that had once been filled with whispers of fear and respect for Monica's manipulative ways were now filled with the sound of truth being spoken aloud. The facade she had carefully crafted over the years crumbled, and with it, the grip she had held on the community loosened. The word spread quickly. People who had once turned a blind eye to her actions now realized the extent of her cruelty. Monica had been more than just a nosy neighbor. She had been a bully, a thief, and a woman willing to do anything to maintain control. The fact that she had used her brother's authority as a police officer to intimidate and manipulate others had shocked the entire neighborhood. No longer could anyone pretend to believe in her innocent, helpful demeanor. The Rock, standing on the edge of his property, could feel the change in the air. There was no longer any tension hanging over his backyard. The sun had set, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and purple, and for the first time in weeks he could finally breathe without looking over his shoulder. His peace had been restored, not just in his backyard, but in the entire neighborhood. He had taken a stand, not just for his property, but for the community that had been victimized by Monica and Chad's actions. The Rock had fought for his rights, and in doing so had inadvertently become a beacon of justice in a place that had long needed it. The fear that had once ruled his days was gone, and in its place was a newfound sense of empowerment. In the coming days, as the news of the arrests circulated, more people came forward with stories of how they, too, had been affected by Monica's reign of terror. The once quiet town began to come together, united in the wake of her exposure. Neighbors who had once stayed silent, afraid of crossing Monica, now spoke out. They shared their experiences, and slowly, the dark cloud that had hung over the neighborhood for so long began to lift. For the Rock, it was a bittersweet victory. He had been forced to confront the darkness in his own backyard, but he had emerged stronger, and more importantly, he had done so without compromising his principles. He didn't take joy in seeing Monica fall, but he was satisfied knowing that justice had been served. As days turned into weeks, the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. But for the Rock, things would never quite be the same. There was a peace now, an undeniable calm that settled over his home, but the events of the past few days had left their mark on him. The battle he had fought was over, but the memory of it lingered, a reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control. He spent more time in his backyard, once again enjoying the solitude that had originally drawn him to this place. The pool was his sanctuary, the perfect spot to clear his mind and recharge. But this time, as he lay on a lounge chair under the warm sun, he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. He had stood his ground. He had protected his home. And, most importantly, he had helped expose the darkness that had hidden behind Monica's false smile for so long. The neighborhood, once divided by fear and resentment, had come together in the wake of the scandal. People who had once been afraid of speaking out now found their voices, and the sense of unity that blossomed in the aftermath of Monica's arrest was palpable. The Rock had not only fought for his rights, but had also given the community the courage to reclaim theirs. Officer Daniels, who had been part of the ordeal, visited the Rock a few days later, offering a sincere apology for the way things had gone down. "I'm sorry it took this long for the right thing to be done," Daniels said, his expression one of regret. "You didn't deserve any of it, but I'm glad we were able to make things right in the end." The Rock nodded, accepting the apology. "Thank you for listening, Officer Daniels. Not everyone would have believed me. It means a lot." Daniels gave a small, regretful smile. "I can't believe it took this much for us to do the right thing, but better late than never, right?" The Rock chuckled softly, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in weeks. Yeah, better late than never. As the days passed, the air around the Rock's home seemed lighter, freer. He could once again enjoy his quiet swim without the looming threat of an uninvited guest. The peace he had fought so hard for had returned, and for the first time in a long time, he could simply be himself, without fear. The neighborhood was different now. Monica and Chad's actions had forced people to face uncomfortable truths, but in the end, it had united the community in ways that had seemed impossible before. The Rock's victory wasn't just his own, it was the neighborhood's, and as he took a deep breath, feeling the warm sun on his face, he knew that justice had been served, not only for him, but for everyone who had lived in the shadow of Monica's cruelty. And as he dove back into his pool, the cool water rushing over him, the Rock knew that this was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment of complete solitude, in a place where he could finally feel at peace, just as it should have always been.